A few sobering facts about the London housing crisis, why housing should be the top of every potential mayor's manifesto. In the last decade alone, London has lost 8,000 social rented homes. Over the last 5 years, the number of homeless people in London has doubled, during which time the number of affordable homes being built has fallen by exactly a third, which means that in 2 years' time, the number of affordable homes across the whole country will be 1 million fewer than there were in 1980. So just a few kind of points to begin with. And yet, London is booming. So it's not a question of a lack of units being built, it's a lack of the appropriate kind of units being built. Vauxhall 9 Elms, we've got a £15 billion reimagining of this kind of fantasy land of 26 new towers, 16,000 new homes being built in Vauxhall 9 Elms. Luxury flats serviced by 5-star hotels with their own karaoke rooms en suite, where just 12% will be affordable. And as we all know, affordable housing now means up to 80% of market rent, so not affordable for, I would imagine, most people sitting in this room. In a borough where the policy is 40 to 50% affordable housing, that's the target that those two boroughs are aiming for. Then we've got the magical land of Earl's Court, where after an £8 billion regeneration project, there'll be 7,000 new homes, of which 11% will be affordable. Once again, the borough has an aspirational target of 40 to 50% affordable homes. Finally, the Bishopsgate goods yard, which is still awaiting judgment by Boris Johnson. 40-storey towers of luxury flats, which will cast most of Shoreditch into near permanent shadow. The developer submitted an application with no affordable housing and then said, we'll give you 10% as a gesture of goodwill. An independent viability study has found that 40% could easily be achievable on that site. The reason all of this happens, I think, and the kind of most fundamental reason that we have a housing crisis in London is down to the financial viability assessment, which looks like this. So this is the redacted viability assessment that came from the Bishopsgate goods yard scheme. Let's just see what we can glean from this document. So hidden from public view, the one part of the planning application which isn't actually publicly accessible is the most important part, the bit that actually explains why there can be such little, keeps on going, many, many black pages. Good use of public sector photocopying services there. And it's, the viability assessment is a way of a developer proving, actually, proving with science and maths and Excel spreadsheets why they can't meet the target, why they can't meet the affordable housing target, why, when they're building multi-million-pound flats, it's just simply too much to deliver 50%. Now, just unpicking the history of where viability came from and kind of how it became so influential, I was shocked to learn, actually, when I looked into this, that it was actually Ken Livingstone who introduced it into the London plan in 2004, but for a completely different reason that developers are now using it for. Back then, it was to actually justify his target of 50% affordable housing across the board, which was the kind of statutory level back in those days. It was a way of making developers prove that they could do it. So it was a kind of open book thing of saying, we know it's possible. By doing this viability assessment, you can actually show us, how your figures stack up and that it's eminently possible. What they hadn't really figured out is that developers can employ much better people with Excel spreadsheets than local authorities. So the kind of methods that were developed, the Three Dragons toolkits and all of these other viability toolkits were redeployed for a completely different purpose to actually prove, from the developer's point of view, that these targets weren't achievable. That was made a whole lot worse in 2012 with the introduction of the National Planning Policy Framework, which in the coalition's bonfire of red tape triumphantly slashed 1,300 pages of planning policy down to a 65-page pamphlet. The most important section of which, I think, is this. Plans should be deliverable. Therefore, sites and scale of development should not be subject to such a scale of obligations and policy burdens, notice the word burden there, that their ability to be developed viably is threatened. So essentially, if planning policy stands in the way of a development happening, then ignore it, because viable development is much more important than sticking to planning policy. This is how a viability assessment works. This is the usual development equation. On the left, you've got the total scheme value. So once the scheme is finished, the value of the private sale flats and the receipt from the affordable provider, what a scheme is worth once it's finished, essentially. On the other side of the scale, you've got the total costs of the scheme, and those two things match once you've put your construction costs, your profit, which very interestingly in viability is enshrined as a cost to the developer, 20% profit, your professional fees, your interest from the bank loan, the value of the land, what you've paid for the site, and the community infrastructure levy and section 106, which is the purple bit at the top, which is where the affordable housing comes from. Those two things have to balance. And essentially, it's a way of determining how much you'll pay for the site. So you add your construction, your fees, your profit, and then you have your residual land value, and that's what you paid to the landowner in theory. What's actually happened is that developers have paid vastly over the odds for sites in London, given that London land values have spiraled completely out of control. And so this mechanism is kind of worked out in reverse. You have your land value fixed. So the red section is a huge chunk of the right-hand side. So everything else then gets squeezed. And obviously the first thing to get squeezed is the affordable housing. Now developers can make that process a lot easier by massively inflating their construction costs and decreasing the projected sales values. So you say, well, my solid marble bathtub's being hand-carved in Carrara. It's not a cheap building to build. Right-hand side immediately goes up, and you say, oh, the market's not looking good at the moment. These flats will only sell for $500,000, not 10 million. And lo and behold, the conclusion of the viability assessment is, well, we can't do 50% affordable. We'll give you 5%. And all of those calculations happen in the redacted viability assessment, which are those black pages that we saw earlier. So just a couple of examples. The Greenwich Peninsula, being developed by a Hong Kong developer, Night Dragon, a £5 billion project for 12,000 homes, just 22% of which will be affordable, again in a borough where the target is 40 to 50%. A housing expert who read the viability assessment, which they finally got hold of after years of taking the developer to tribunal, said they're saying that the sales values of their luxury flats on this prime riverside site opposite Canary Wharf, on land they've acquired at a discounted rate from the GLA, along with a £50 million housing grant, would not be enough to cover their costs, which is frankly absurd. When he looked into it in more detail, he found that the scheme had approximately been undervalued by £500 million. So the section on the left of that previous diagram where you say what your scheme's going to be worth, they'd undervalued it by 500 million. The Haygate Estate, probably one of the most controversial regeneration projects in London, a £3 billion scheme which has replaced 1,200 mainly social rented homes with over 2,300 units. Good news story, until you realise that only 74 of those units will remain social rented. Southwark sold the site to the developer for 50 million, having spent 45 million cleaning it up, while at the same time estimating its gross development value to be 990 million, so another great deal for the taxpayer. Again, when you track back into the viability assessment, Lend-Lease said, well, we'll probably sell these flats for about £600 per square foot. I went down to the marketing suite the other day, and they're selling for an average of £1,000 per square foot. So again, it's this kind of conscious undervaluing on the left-hand side of that equation. And so the value of the properties has gone up massively, and yet the affordable housing level remains just 74 units. So my three-point solution, which should be on the list of any budding mayoral candidate. Number one, remove viability from the planning process. Don't regulate it. I would just say scrap it altogether. Introduce statutory levels of affordable housing, rather than them being these aspirational targets. When a local plan says 50%, it means a spectrum of 0 to 50. It doesn't mean a statutory level of 50%. So make them statutory targets in order to decrease land values. Once you enforce a policy, it immediately means that the value becomes less. So we'll stop having these kind of insane land values in London that prices might begin to reflect policy burdens for a change. And finally, if the developer won't play ball and won't meet the statutory housing target, then gives local authority the power to CPO the site and build the housing themselves, which is what they should be doing in the first place. That's the end of my manifesto.